So I'm just selecting the option to go live and we start. Give me a second to check that is okay. And great. So hello everyone. Today it's me who will be hosting a Neuroccino. Welcome to Neuroccino, this weekly discussion about science. And today is Eduardo who is presenting. So you he already shared the link of the paper he's presenting on the chat. And yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Marcela. So I'm sharing my screen with you. Can you see it? Okay, so yeah, so we usually present very recent stuff about science, but for today's I decided to resume the program launched by Lilith about historical papers on the topic of neuroscience. And specifically, I've chosen to present a couple of papers by a French neurologist, Pierre Marie, who lived between like the 19th and the 20th century. And so a short note on him. So he was a neurologist formed in the lab of Jean-Martin Charcot. He worked at the Salpêtrière Hospital and at Bicêtre Hospital as well. He had been a professor of pathological anatomy and later on of neurology. He is indeed in one of the most famous painting of the history of neuroscience, which you might recognize, the clinical lecture at the Salpêtrière. And so this is Jean-Martin Charcot, and here you can see also Pierre Marie. And he is mostly known for like his fierce opposition to the strict localizationist approach of well, most of his colleagues at the time, and especially of the position of Jules de Gérine, with whom the debate indeed became often more personal than scientific, so to say. And apparently, for example, I don't know if this is true, maybe it's just a myth, but you find some accounts reporting that de Gérine once even challenged Marie to a duel, like an actual duel. So I don't know if this is true, but this gives you like an idea of the level of the discussion. Anyway, I chose a couple of papers to present you this less strictly localizationist approach of Pierre Marie, especially for its implication in the study of aphasia. So the first paper I'd like to present is this one. It's a paper from 1897 titled The Evolution of Language considered in the perspective of the study of aphasia. And it's a very interesting one because the premise for this paper, it's the following, that is that to understand aphasia, to understand language deficit, we have to have some working theory of language and of its evolution as a whole. So you cannot understand the deficit of language if you do not understand how language evolved. That said, Marie goes on and proposes a theory of language evolution of both spoken and written language evolution. The theory on spoken language evolution is most likely outdated, but it's very interesting because it starts from the definition of a natural language, what he calls a natural language, and this is basically to him communicating internal states to other members of your species via sequences of sounds. And he says that if this is the definition of natural language, then of course humans possess it, but also a lot of animals possess this faculty. And it's mostly innate. It has been shaped by thousands, millions of years of evolution. But of course, humans also need like more expressive powers according to him. And the fourth, he says that humans basically shaped another kind of language, a conventional language, which is what we call like human language, and which is hypothesized to be like a progressive shaping of onomatopoeias into words, and from words into more complex sentences and grammar and so on. This language, according to Marie, is purely artificial, and it has been shaped generation after generation for like the entire history of the humankind. Then he goes on in describing the evolution of written language, and the description of the evolution of written languages is way more, I'd say, up to date. It still resembles to the description that you would find today for the evolution of written languages. I think it's in short is he says like okay, we started from these ideograms, which are barely more than simple drawings of the object you want to convey the meaning of. For example, here in this image, like you have the hieroglyph, the Egyptian hieroglyph for the sun, which is a sun, a mountain, the second one, a snake, flower, and so on. You have some of them are more complex. Say here in the second line, you have like the symbol for roof, night, and rain, which is they still have a good amount of visual encoding, which is not purely phonetic. So this is not a writing system per se, because most of the information is conveyed by drawing. But he says like from that point on, we made our way to an actual writing system by making these ideograms phonetic symbols. And this happened when you drop the meaning of the drawing and you start using the sound of the word that the drawing is supposed to symbolize. So instead of you using like the symbol of the sun to indicate that the sun, the idea of sun, you use the symbol to convey the sound of the word, which is, for example, in the ancient Egyptian is ra. So you stop using the symbol for meaning the sun, and you use it to convey the syllable ra. And that's it. From that point on, you have a writing system, a phonetic, syllabic writing system, which still requires a lot of symbols, but it's definitely a phonetic encoding of language. And from that point on, you can produce also an alphabetic writing system, which is fairly simple. It's just an iteration of this operation I just explained to make the writing system even simpler. So instead of using the symbol to convey the entire syllable, you just use the symbol, for example, to convey the sound of just one letter. So for example, instead of the entire syllable ha, you convey the sound of r. And yeah, from that, you have an alphabetic system. So this entire premise, which is provided by Marie, is needed because he now goes back to the theory of aphasia, and he says, okay, if both spoken and written language are conventional, so conventional, again, according to him, and not natural, not so innate, then how can we explain the fact that there are so much specialized and localized neural bases for these functions? And you have to keep in mind that at this point, Marie is arguing against theories of aphasia developed by Paul Borca, Wernicke, Jules Degerine, and so on, that have been hypothesizing specific neural bases for each language modality. So you have a specific area for reading, a specific area for writing, a specific area for understanding spoken language, and a specific area for producing spoken language. And what Pierre-Marie is pointing out here is how can you hypothesize such things if language, especially written language, has not been around for such a long time to shape by an evolutionary scale any neural basis. And so from this point on, he basically argues that, for example, spoken language, despite being conventional, has been around for enough time to progressively reshape the brain areas that were responsible for the natural language, which according to him, we share with animals. But for written language, this is definitely not possible because it has not been around for, basically, it has been around for too little time and for too few people to allow such a huge and massive brain organization. You need thousands and thousands of years of evolution to do that. So it follows that reading and writing can only be performed in the brain by adapting pre-existing areas devoted to language, visual processing, and motor function. And to support this view, he actually reports cases of patients with pure alexia, which is a deficit for reading, so patients are not able to read anymore. And one of the problems back then is that there were cases, described cases of patients with pure alexia, so deficit in reading, and sometimes also with agraphia, so a deficit in writing, and sometimes not without agraphia, so patients that were either unable to read because of a brain lesion and also to write because of that lesion, and patients that could not read anymore, but they were still able to producing a writing output. And so how to explain that? According to Marie, this can be explained considering the evolution of language and evolution of written language specifically, because according to him, if written language is relying on the adaptation of other brain areas that are devoted to other functions, such as indeed actual language, vision, and motor output, then you can explain this dissociation with basically a difference in experience, different in literacy, for example. And he says, patients with a low literacy and a low experience in writing will likely develop both alexia and agraphia for lesion to what we would say the visual stream. And this is because the ability to write is strongly relying on what he calls visual memory, visual representation, we would say. While on the other side, patients with high literacy that are used to write a lot, they would only show alexia for a lesion of the visual ventral stream, and this will be the case because their phonological system will be intact, and their ability to write in that case would no longer rely on visual memory, but at that point it should be like mostly redirected to the motor system, so that they can write without relying on visual representation, or not so much. And in conclusion, he says this is one way to show that there's no need, at least, there's no need to assume that our brain has specialized areas for reading and writing, because it's all relying on previous functions that the brain already possessed, and that it's absolutely, if you want to prove that there's a specific brain for reading and writing, you need basically stronger evidence than the one that has been provided so far, which at that point were basically like some cases described, for example, by the gyrus and some lesions in the parietal cortex and in the ventral visual stream. So this is the first paper. It's quite short, actually. The second paper I would like to shortly present. It's a more theoretical paper. It's a paper from 1906, so basically 10 years later, whose title is a revision of the issue on aphasia. The left inferior frontal gyrus does not play any role in the function of language. As again, as the titles are, quite polemic. But it's an interesting paper. Actually, it's of course it's a paper against the main taxonomy of aphasia at the time, which is basically Broca's aphasia as a production aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia as a comprehension deficit for language. And it's interesting because the starting point is a clinical consideration. It says you people have been relying too much on theory and deduction. You have not been relying enough on actual empirical data to understand what aphasia is. If you look at patients, there's no such thing as a comprehensions versus the production deficit. All patients have, to some degree and to some extent, a deficit in comprehension. Doesn't matter if they are Broca's aphasia patients or Wernicke's aphasia patients. And from that point on, he basically tried to demonstrate that there's no such thing as different kind of aphasia. There is just one kind of aphasia, which is the Wernicke's aphasia, following for lesion of the temporal parietal junction. And basically, like a supramarginal gyrus, angular gyrus, and the posterior section of the superior and middle temporal gyrus, according to Marie. And he says that even the actual true aphasia, which is the Wernicke's aphasia, is not a mere language deficit. It's not a deficit in the understanding of words. It's just a decrease in intellectual capacity of the brain, according to Pierre Marie. And this theory of aphasia, which is a very strong theory to sustain, it's basically derived from the observation, according to Marie, that most of the patients actually have problems not only in understanding spoken language, they also have problem in understanding non-verbal like commands, non-verbal instructions. And so according to Marie, then it's not a language deficit anymore. This is probably due to the fact that Marie does not make any distinction between apraxia, ideomotor or conceptual apraxia, and aphasia, which indeed are two very close neurological and neuropsychological syndromes. But yeah, so it's debatable, but it stems from that point. But there are some valid points about the rigid taxonomy that has been produced by people such as Paul Broca and so on. But yeah, this is the main point. So that there's no such thing as a multiple aphasia. There's just one deficit, and all patients have also all patients have comprehension problems, not just either production or the other. And yeah, so there's also some consideration on the anatomical basis, of course. For example, he says, yeah, the Wernicke's aphasia is following lesion of the temporal junctions and or the nearby white matter. If you have a patient that could be classified as Broca's aphasia patient, it's just a combination of for example, yeah, Wernicke's aphasia and a lesion that basically either destroy the lentiform nuclei, such as here, or the connection between the Wernicke's area and the lentiform nuclei. So it's a basically, according to him, what it is called Broca's aphasia is a combination of Wernicke's aphasia and apraxia of speech. And apraxia of speech is not aphasia, of course. So yeah, that's it. I hope it was clear enough. It's some old stuff, so I would rather stop and leave some space for questions if you have some.
Great. Thank you very much, Eduardo. Always it's very interesting to see like how science was performed before in the past, or like the thoughts of the previous researchers. So yeah, we have already questions. So Eva, you can ask first.
Yeah, thank you for the paper. I was wondering, as someone that doesn't have a lot of idea on current language theories, what are some things that you see still hold now, or some that would really not, like they're not considered this way now?
Yeah, okay, so for example, one thing that it still holds, for example, is the description of the written language evolution. That's definitely more or less the way we think it went. Here, Marie provides example from the ancient Egyptian evolution, because it was the language for which they had some knowledge about. But I think that most of this stuff has been proved for also like other places where written languages have been invented, like Mesopotamian languages, Chinese languages, and so on. So you basically start from these more pictographic representations, and you switch to a certain point to this phonological representation, where you stop using the symbols for the object and you start using the symbol for the phonological form that encodes the name for that object. It's almost like if you have some familiarity with rebus, it's basically it's that process. This is still holding. On the other side, the description of spoken language evolution is definitely outdated. Like it's almost a cultural theory of language evolution. It has some merits of trying to deal with the fact that language must be evolved from somewhere, and this is a point where actual current theories of language still struggle with, because we are still not able to explain how language evolved, because it's such a huge faculty, such a huge thing, and apparently it came out of nowhere, because our closest relative in the evolutionary tree does not have language. There are birds which has like nice like productions ability, but it's not language. So this is still a point that it's sure the explanation of Marie is not valid, but it's still a point causing problems today. And then there's, of course, if you read, it's difficult to see. There's no precise point or sentence that makes you understand this, but it's clear that it's a word that where there's no theory about the nature of language. It's a pre-Chomskyan era. There's no such thing as a grammar or something about phonology, but the ideas are not clear. They don't have a working theory of what language is. They don't have psycholinguistics. And but at least here there is an attempt to retrace the evolution of language to explain also aphasia and stuff like that. This is definitely a point of merit. I hope this answers your question right away.
Yeah, definitely. Thank
Great. Lilith?
I think
you're muted.
Okay. Thank you, Eduardo, for presenting this paper. I don't know if this paper actually exists in English translation.
I fear not, and this is also the reason why I choose to present the stuff.
So yeah, this is very, very special because maybe first time we are discussing this in English. So what I missed a bit, could you explain one more time what was his logic when he says that we don't actually need to find specific locations for reading or writing? What was his thought process?
Yeah, so it's so at that point people were assuming that there was like a specific center for visual words representations, for example, in the ventral stream, let's say. And there are specific center for graphic representations and a specific center for writing out your internal representation. And the same for spoken language. And so a very strict localization is approached. Each language modality, each language input and output modality has its own area. And Marie says this doesn't make any sense from an evolution standpoint, which is the main point of the paper, because written language has been invented a few thousand years ago. And even that is irrelevant, because like mass alphabetization, it's something that has not been around unless like the last like 150 years, and not even for the entire humankind. Like if you go back, he says directly, if you go back in your family trees for a few generations, most of those people were most likely not able to read, let alone writing. So there's no grounding for there's no space at all to justify the hypothesis of having some specialized areas in your brain, because what's the point? There's not enough time to evolve such a thing in such a short period of time. And the other reason you don't need to hypothesize like those specific areas is that if reading and writing is relying on other functions, then it's just relying on other functions. So you just need the ability to process visual information, the ability to produce motor output, and processing language. I hope that clarifies a little bit.
So basically, his argument is that the first one is that there is not enough time to evolve a new function.
Neural basis, specific neural basis for that function, not in a few thousand years, which is, I think, fairly acceptable.
And the second reason is that we already have different specialized other things. So we don't need
he says that
is he like localization is about other stuff, but like only reading is not specialized.
He's more willing to accept specialized areas for functions that have been clearly selected through evolution. So vision, motor processing, sure, but reading, yeah.
Okay, so only language related stuff is not localized, the rest is
Yeah, the description
special
of
function.
spoken language basis is a little bit trickier. It's not 100% clear. It says, yeah, it has been around for more. It has had the time to reshape a little bit the brain areas, but not as much as writing. Yeah.
Thank you. And the last question, I want to put him in a context, in a sense, like, well, he was opposing to Broca, Wernicke, but were there some neurologists that were going in line with his thought process?
Oh, good question. I guess so.
Like, who was his, I don't know, student or?
Yeah, I don't remember how the students ended up. But the fact that the predominant view in the following century was mostly like the Broca's, Wernicke's, Lichtheim views, I would say, yeah, this line of research was not predominant. The idea itself of recycling neural centers to perform another function popped up again, like at the beginning of this century with the works and again on reading, like for example, Stanislas Dehaene, Cohen, and those labs. So yeah, I think most of his work is not forgotten, of course, but yeah, it had less impact on the future of neuropsychology compared to other stuff.
Well, but now we will have this, I don't know, question about how the extended realities and all these VR and stuff will be recycled in our brain, or so it can be relevant, sort of, because it's sort of you're starting a new function.
It's an interesting standpoint. I mean, sure, there's a lot of limitations, but yeah. I think here I also have a question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, right. There is a last question, maybe from Eva.
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions. So in your second paper, the author talked about Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia, and he said that Broca's aphasia is basically Wernicke's aphasia plus some sort of apraxia, I think you mentioned. But I was wondering, did the author, the thought process, did he think that Broca's aphasia's lesions are also so the combination of Wernicke and apraxia, for example? Does it mean that if Broca's lesion is present, the author assumed that the lesion in Wernicke's ear is also present because he says it's a combination, or does he just assume the symptoms of Wernicke's aphasia? And second question, because you covered the evolution, I was wondering, did author talk, or is there anything about mirror neurons? Because the evolution of language, there's a lot of theories, and also there's theory that it was a random mutation, but also there's a theory that it stems from mirror neurons, from monkeys, from grasping, which, activates the inferior frontal gyrus, which is homotopic region in human brain. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I'll try to answer you as shortly and clearly as possible. So the first question is, yes, indeed, Broca's aphasia is Wernicke's aphasia plus apraxia of speech, even in its anatomical basis. So it first provides a definition of what it means by Wernicke's aphasia, Broca's aphasia, and what we would call today apraxia of speech. And he says, okay, Wernicke's aphasia is this stuff, apraxia of speech is this stuff, and Broca's aphasia is the two things together. And it's the case because also their lesions are basically the combination. So Broca's aphasia is the combination of a lesion to the Wernicke's territory, so the temporal parietal junctions, more or less. And
is that always the case, though? Sorry. Is there another case, or is just a frontal area lesion?
Yeah, this is like his point of view. He says that the inferior frontal gyrus is not necessary for language because you can observe patients who have a lesion in the inferior frontal gyrus, left inferior frontal gyrus, and that don't have aphasia and Broca's aphasia, and you can observe cases where the inferior frontal gyrus is intact and there's Broca's aphasia. He says that this is the case because first of all, there's variability in the vascularization tree, for example, and also because the white matter is relevant. There's some nice consideration of the role of white matter, because he says that Broca's aphasia can either emerge as, a global lesion of the medial cerebral artery. In that case, you have massive lesion of the left hemisphere, and you would lesion almost surely the Wernicke's territory, the white matter connecting the Wernicke's territory to other brain areas, and specifically to the lentiform nuclei, which to Pierre-Marie are the centers, the brain nuclei responsible for the apraxia symptoms. And he says that apraxia can emerge for either left or right lesions, for example, of the lentiform nuclei, which is not the case for the Wernicke's aphasia. But indeed, if you observe patients with the so-called, according to him, Broca's aphasia, it's because they have Wernicke's aphasia. So either a lesion of the temporal palatal junction or the underlying white matter, and or a lesion to the lentiform nuclei, or the connection from the lentiform nuclei to the Wernicke's territory. And these consideration on the white matter and the different variability on the vascularization of the brain that you can observe in between people, he says those things are responsible for the variability in symptoms, let's say, that you can observe in aphasic patients. I hope this answered the first question.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And the second one was sorry again about the mirror neurons and I have no idea. Mirror neurons are clearly like a modern idea, has been discovered in great apes. I wouldn't know if this could. I don't know how this could fit with it's because the evolution of the theory on evolution of language he describes is more like on the theoretical side, like how language evolved as function, not much about the brain basis. Also because his thesis is that there's no clear brain basis, at least for written language, because there's been not enough time for these to evolve. Yeah, that's it. I think that those ideas are too distant, and back then they clearly didn't have those level of fine-grained. I mean, they could barely observe dead neurons, so I don't know if this consideration of electrophysiology of the cortex could have been made back then.
I was just thinking, as grasping can be like also gestures and sign language. So it's not like I'm a believer, but I think that's not just from anatomical standpoint, we can consider that as an early stage of language, because people who use sign language also activate language regions. So
yeah, but I think that for those people back then, like sign language, I don't know if it was considered proper language. Because if you read those papers, maybe you should translate them. There's clearly this idea that like almost like written and spoken language are almost different things in a way. There's clearly a lack of theoretical ground to explain what language is as a function. Is it a function? Most of the theories up to that point in the 18th, especially in the 19th centuries, would have explained language mostly from the standpoint of words, like single words, and as an epiphenomenon of memory, for example, because language sounded like something like that should be related to memory more than being something on its own, which is it's sure it's naive for us, but if you think about it, like retrieval from memory, it's still a huge point in any model of language. So yes, it's naive, but not so much. So yeah.
Yeah, very
Thank you.
exciting. Thank you very much, Eduardo. We are already on time to finish this
Way over.
session. And so thank you very much for attending Neuroccino. Thank you, Eduardo, for presenting. And I hope you have a very nice and exciting week in science, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.